Out for 3 rounds. Payne Haas, you pain in the ass. Hey everyone, what is going on? Welcome back to another video from A Man Talks NRL SuperCoach. Guessing from that intro, you can tell that today we're going to be talking about the front row forward options that we can consider when building our team to start the season. Let's get into it. So obviously, as you can see, Payne Haas not being there means we actually have to think about who to put in our front row. It's unbelievable, right? Usually he's just been the set and forget option, but given his suspension, we're going to have to it's just too much money to hold on your bench, I think, to start the year. So we're just going to have to consider some alternatives, but fortunately we've got quite a few that we can talk through. So I've got here just a few different options. I'll start off with David Klemmer, I think second best averaging prop last year. And he had a really good first half of the season, 2/3 of the season, where he was getting really good minutes and base stats. And he had a really strong PPM, as you can see, at 1.18, and averaging close to 60 minutes was really strong. But we did see it start to tail off at the end of the year. So I'm just not quite sure what the minutes situation is going to be for him, given that they've added Tyson Frizzell, so that's another forward in the nice pack who'll be potentially taking some minutes away from him. It's owned by about 13%, which is probably what I expect. As you can see, the ownership is fairly spread amongst the front row options, apart from a couple which I'll touch on later. For me, I think he's a solid option. He doesn't really offer much else in terms of just base stats. He does offload, but I think that was actually part of the reasons why his points did dry up towards the end of the season. He just wasn't offloading as much as he was at the start of the year, which is really a shame, because obviously with offloads we're getting extra points, which we love. So for me, it's kind of a bit of maybe a wait and see with him. I think 590k it's a bit pricey as well. So I think personally I might just hold off from him for the start of the season, but he might be one that I'll maybe pick up later in the year if he's potentially dropped in price. Now Junior Paulo is actually someone who I think I'm really strongly considering, because the Eels do have a very good start to the season. They've got some easy games to start the year, and I think he really is an integral part of their kind of build-up play when it comes to the attack, because obviously he can be a bit of a link man. He's sometimes he looks like a halfback playing in a props body, and he does have potential to contribute in attacking ways. I remember a couple of times in the season where he'd be close to the line, he'd just pop an offload, and then that player would then crash over for a try. So he gets offload, line break assist, try assist, so many points just from that. The question with him, I guess, is the minutes. I did pick him up at one point during the season, and he just wasn't performing as I would have wanted him to. The minutes just were a bit inconsistent, and I think he just wasn't offloading as much, and he just wasn't getting the work rate that I'd like. I mean, a 1.19 ppm is really good as well, but I think for him, I wouldn't expect the minutes to change too much. So I think I really just have to consider then the upside of his potential attacking output. But I think he's a bit more enticing to me than Klemmer, given that he's 20k cheaper. He's a bit less owned, which is a bit appealing for me as well. But he's, I think, a good consideration, given that the Eels have a good start to the season. Takeaho, I think, is actually a really solid option. He's a little bit cheaper than Paulo at 560k. He's slightly more owned at 12%. Obviously, these percentages are due to change. This is just at the time that I pull this together. But I think it's averaging the same as Paulo. His PPM wasn't quite as much, but what he does have in his locker potentially is the goal kicking. Now, this is like a throwback to the Corey Parker days with the absolute legend of SuperCoach and fantasy. The guy who a prop or a forward who can goal kick is an absolute gold. And I think especially with the Roosters, who are a strong team, so you'd expect them to be scoring tries, and minutes per game of 57. I think it was a bit inflated because obviously there were times during the season where Mawira Hargrave missing some injuries, or obviously Cordner was missing a large part of the season. So there were some times where he was playing full 80-minute games. So I wouldn't expect him to be playing those that often as well. Obviously Cordner is going to be missing, I think, the first part of the season. So that potentially might actually increase his minutes. And if we do get confirmation of the goal kicking situation with the Roosters, apparently Lachlan Lamb might be someone who can also goal kick. Goal kicking prop is always going to be really enticing. The Roosters don't have a great start to the season. I think they've got some difficult opponents, but it's the Roosters. They've been one of the best teams in the NRL for years now, and I think he's just a really good worker as well, really solid option. I think you can't really go too wrong with him. Moving on to Papali. I think Papali's obviously, as you can see, he's going to be a really popular option to start the season. He's currently owned by about 23% of the game. He's one of those people who just has a really good engine, and he does have the odd try in him as well. He definitely is a prop who I think tends to score more tries than others, which obviously is really good for SuperCoach. The problem is it's hard to call consistently when he might score a try. It doesn't really matter if the opponent's easy or if they're difficult. I think it's really hard to call that. So I think we have to think of that as just a potential bonus, but really I think we should just be focusing at the work rate, which is, again, it's pretty good. It's a 1.19 ppm, averaging very similar to the likes of Paulo, Takeaho. His minutes is a little bit down, and I think potentially that is an issue with Papali, given that he is so important to that Raiders team. He also does play Origin, so I think, he would probably have more of a likelihood to have his minutes managed. So I think as a result, there were times at the end of the season as well, I think, obviously in the lead up to the finals, the Raiders were not taking any chances with him. They were resting him in games or starting him on the bench as well. So I think that's potentially something to be, wary of, I think, when you're picking Papali. But I think overall, it's a pretty safe option. So I think you can't really go too wrong with him. Fanua Blake. Now, Fanua Blake, I think obviously he had a lot of injuries last season, so we didn't really get a consistent kind of, run of form from him. But obviously he's moved now to the Warriors, and I think the Warriors have now kind of loaded up in the forwards. They've got himself and Ben Murdoch-Masila are the new additions to join the likes of Defanga, Tohu Harris. I think the Warriors forwards are going to be really strong, and he is a good forward, and he does have a lot of offload in him as well, which actually the Warriors in general love to offload because they really were successful last year when they were working on this kind of second phase play, the likes of Tavanga, Tohu Harris as well. So I think he'd be a big, beneficiary in that kind of attack in terms of providing a lot of offloads. So I think, if they encourage a lot of offloads, I think that means more points for him. Depends on his minutes as well, because obviously there are a lot of good forwards at the Warriors, so he might not be playing the minutes compared to the likes of the others that I've just mentioned as well. And his average is a little bit less than the others as well. The Warriors don't have a great start to the season. I think it's an okay start, but again, with forwards, I think it's less of a concern as to the opponent. It's more just we want to be concerned about their minutes and their points per minute as well. So I think his point per minute is very similar to the other guys that I've mentioned before. So I think you can, if you're looking to maybe save some money in the prop, you can go with Fanua Blake at 530k. Personally, I think the other four that I've mentioned I would prefer. Especially I think Papali, Takeaho and Junior Paulo. I think I would probably choose the three of them over Fanua Blake. But if you want to be a little bit different because he is less owned than the others, I think he could be pretty solid. Moving on, we've got to James Fisher-Harris at 522k. Now for me, he's a bit of an interesting option. I think I owned him for a large part of last season. Unfortunately, I kind of picked him up at the wrong time. I think he'd had a good run of about 4 or 5 games, and he was well priced, and at the time last season he was a dual player where he had front row and second row forward flexibility. Doesn't have that this year, but I thought, oh great, I'll pick him up. And he was just getting a run of scores in the 40s and 50s. I think his minutes were a little bit down, but I think he had a really good end in the last, 2 to 3 games in the season, and he's a really, really good, real life player. I think with SuperCoach though, he can be a little bit, not inconsistent I'd say, but underwhelming maybe is the word, because he looks so good in real life. But yeah, as you can see, his points per minute is 1.01. It's a little bit down compared to the other guys who I've mentioned before. Obviously though, James Tarmel, he has gone to the West Tigers, so there's a potential for more workload for the likes of James Fisher-Harris. So I think, he could be a good consideration in that regard. The Panthers also do have a good start to the season in terms of opponents, but I think that actually might, impact him negatively, because he's not really one of the guys who is useful for the attacking plays, compared to say someone like Junior Paulo for the Eels. So that actually might mean he just doesn't have to work as much as forwards who've got more difficult opponents to start the season. So I think those combination of factors, I think for me, will just kind of turns me off Fisher-Harris. But I can see the appeal and why people are going for him. But for me personally, I just don't think I'm going to be going there. And finally, the hot property in the front row forward, Tino Fasuamalawi. Mate, I sound like the Channel 9 commentators that kept butchering his surname all of last season. I'll get there eventually during the season. But yeah, anyway, 505k I think is well priced for him, and you can see why. 40% of the game are currently, owning him, because obviously he's the cheapest of the kind of gun front row forwards that I think, and his PPM 1.26 was really, really strong. I think the thing for him was that he had a lot of games where he was scoring tries, sometimes even 2 tries. So I think that definitely does inflate some of his numbers a bit. Obviously his minutes were down because he was being used in the first part of the season more on the bench, and then he kind of gradually started in the second row or sometimes at prop. So I think at the Titans I'd expect him to be playing more minutes than he was at the Storm. And I think for me, even though he did have scores inflated from scoring tries, the Titans do really have a good start to the season in terms of opponents. So I think the potential is going to be there for him to be getting tries. And, the Titans overall have improved their squad with the likes of Fafita and himself as well. And, they ended the year really, really well. So rumours potentially of Cam Smith going to the Titans, which I think, if Cam Smith is going to the Titans, Tino is getting in my team, because Smith was the one who was delivering these balls just at just near the try line, then Tino's just crashing over. So I think if Smith's in, Tino's in my team as well. So I think that's just something to keep in the back of your mind, that quite know, I guess, what the work rate is and or what the minutes are going to be at the Titans. But I think 505k, I think he's a safe choice. And I think given that he's so highly owned, you might be getting a bit of FOMO if you don't have him in your team. So I think no harm having him. He is listed both at second row and front row, which does come in handy. So I think if you don't want to have one of your spots in the front row being taken up by him, I think you could just move him into your second row. But these guys are the gun options I think you should be considering in the front row. I haven't included players like, say, Dan Safidi. I think the kind of stuff that I mentioned with Clemmer, I think applies to him as well. There's other forwards who potentially might be taking minutes. Safidi was very good last year. Obviously he does, he will probably play Origin. So that's maybe something to factor in terms of his minutes. But yeah, I think, if I was looking at this list, if I had to pick, say, 3, I think Tino, Takeaho and Paulo would be the ones that I would go for. Alright, moving on to the mid-range danger? Nah, just the mid-rangers we'll call them. But there's 4 options here I think are going to be really, really good to have in the front row forward. So we've got Christian Welch, Leota, Joe Fingawi and Ben Murdoch-Masila. Now Welch I think is going to be really, really popular in this kind of price category. He's about 450k. And I think with the loss of Tino, I think people are going to be expecting that he's going to be playing more minutes at the Storm and have a bit of a bigger role in the forwards, which I think is true. And I think his minutes per game potentially might go up from, say, 43 to 50. I think if his minutes do go up to 50 to potentially 55, 60, I think he then becomes really good, because as you can see, his PPM was really, really strong at 1.25. So, averaging 51 from just 43 minutes. It's a really good sign of a good worker. Storm do have tough games as well to start the year. I think they've got the Rabbitohs, the Roosters and the Panthers all in their first 3 games. So I'd expect potentially a lot of defensive work, which might increase the appeal of someone like Welch as well. So I can see why people go for him. I think it's hard to say. I think I'm not sure what minutes he's going to be playing, but I think potentially he might just be worth the punt at 450k. But as I'm going to touch on, there are some potential other options at even cheaper than him. Guys like Moses Leota. Leota is actually the one who I've got in my second front row forward starting position. He's only 350k and he's only owned by about 3%, which I'd expect to maybe stay around that range come the first round lockout. It is a bit more of a punt as well, but I think with the loss of Taumel, he's going to be moving into that starting front row in the Panthers lineup. And I think he's got a really, really good PPM of 1.2. In just 33 minutes a game, he was averaging about 40 points. And I think there was 2 games last season where he started in the starting prop, and I think he was playing like 40 and then 45 minutes, and I think he scored like 45 and 56 points or something. So I think even if he was starting, he's scoring around 45 to 55 points. His price at an average of 40. So I think if he was getting to that 55 to 60 average, he'd then be a really, really good cash cow option. So I think 350k is, if you were trying to save some money in the front row, I think he could be a good option that's going a little bit under the radar, I think, because the other 3 mid-range options that I've got listed here, they're all more owned than him. So I think, with a good PPM, he's going to have that starting role. I think he could be a good option, and he's one who I think I'm going to have in my 17, maybe not in my second front row starting spot, but maybe one on the bench. Next I've got Joe Afongauhi. So he's now gone to the West Tigers from the Broncos. Priced at 340k, is a pretty popular option. I'm less hot on him than, say, the likes of Leota. I think his PPM just doesn't really look appealing to me at 0.8. So, he was averaging more minutes than Leota was last season, and he's still averaging about the same. So I think that kind of tells you kind of where I sit on the fence with these two. Although I do see the appeal in him, I think because he is going to be starting at the Tigers, I think last season when he did start for the Broncos, I think he was playing around 50 minutes, and I think he was averaging about 45 to 50 points. So again, he is going to be then averaging above what he's currently priced at, so he could be a good cash generation option. So I think, maybe flip a coin between Leota and Offengawi. I think obviously Offengawi is a bit more popular. The Tigers do have a tough start to the year as well, so maybe you could expect more, defensive workload from your forwards. So for that reason, potentially that might sway you to Offengawi, and if you want to be saving $9,000, I guess you could go him instead of Leota. But I think you can't really go wrong, I think, maybe with either of those two. I'd personally go for Leota because sometimes I do feel like to start the season it's good to have a few kind of less owned players, just to separate yourself a little bit. Those two are too bad of an option. And finally, I got Ben Murdoch-Masila. So 330k, earned by about 16%. Unfortunately, there's no stats on him recently, given that he's been playing the last 3 years in the Super League. But obviously, he's going to be really popular because I think he's predicted to be starting in the second row for the Warriors. And similar to what I mentioned for Fanua Blake, obviously there's going to be a lot of good forwards at the Warriors, so potentially the workload might be shared. But I think, if he's got a starting gig at the Warriors and he's 330k, especially if he's playing in the second row, you could expect his minutes to be more than, say, what they would be if he was playing at prop. So I do see the appeal as to why so many players have chosen him. Again, it's hard to say without knowing what the rotation is kind of going to be. And to be honest, it might be hard to get that information before the start of the season anyway, because round one team lists won't really show us much apart from, say, if he's starting at prop or in the second row. So I think 330k, again, it's not too much of your budget, so I think safe bet, given that we know he's probably going to be in the starting 13. I think Murdoch-Masila, not a bad bet. Alright, and finally we're moving on to the cheapies, or the cash cows. Yes, the cash cows, that's what we all want, isn't it? Fortunately, I think with the front row, there are some good cheap options to start the year, which potentially does reduce the appeal then of those mid-ranges that I just previously touched on, because you might be wanting an approach where you go, say, one gun front row and one cheap front row, and kind of just gonna skip that mid-range category altogether. So I'll start off with Matt Lodge, who just creeps under that 300k mark that I've got. He's owned by about 8%. I'd expect that to be actually going up. And given that Payne Haas is going to be missing the first 3 games of the season, I'd expect, all the Broncos forwards then have to kind of collectively step up a little bit their workload. And, his PPM's not amazing. He's averaging 42 minutes per game and scoring about 38 points. I think in the games that Matt Lodge was actually starting for the Broncos, I think his PPM was actually creeping up past the 0.9 to about 0.95. There's only 3 games, I think, in that spell where he was starting. But he was averaging around the 48 point mark, which is obviously going to be above his 38. So I think for the first 3 games, he could be a good option, given that Haas is out. So if he is starting, he'd be averaging above what he's priced at, and I think he'd be making some money. And the Broncos do have a tough start to the season as well. So I think you'd expect a lot of defensive work from the Broncos, So I think then that makes him more appealing. So I think Matt Lodge, good option to start the season, but I think not maybe a long-term hold, unless he kind of is consistently held in the 17 rotation. But I think he's a safe bet to have at the start of the season, make some money off him, and then offload him later. Next, I've got Ryan James. Not really many stats for him as well, but he's owned by 27% of the game at the moment. I think a lot of those people just see the name and know that he's at the Raiders, but I just don't see how he's going to get into the 17. They've got so many good forwards like Tarpany, Hudson Young, Corey Horsburgh, Harry Onaira. Now, I know the last 2 have, recently had some off-field dramas, put it that way. And I think Ricky Stewart has mentioned that, he's not too keen on having them be in the starting team. But sooner or later, I think they'd get back in there. And I just don't know where Ryan James would fit in. If we know in round 1 team list that he's potentially on the interchange, he might be an option. But for me, I think, given that we just don't know whether he's going to be in the 17, at 237k, yes, he's cheap. But as I'm going to touch on, there are 2 cheaper options than him, who I think are predicted to definitely be in the 17 for their teams respectively. So for me, Ryan James, I think, is not really useful to have, taking out one of your slots if we don't even know he's going to be playing. So I think for me, he would generally be an avoid. But moving on to Spencer Leniu, some of the reasons that I mentioned previously for Moses Leota will definitely apply to Leniu as well. So he's predicted to be the, interchange prop, but given Tarmau's, left, that potentially means increased workload for the Panthers forwards. And he was only averaging about 20 minutes a game last season, but in those 20 minutes his PPM was 1.2, which is really, really solid. So I think, if that minutes per game extended up to say 30, 35, then his average would potentially maybe close to 35, 40 points, and then he'd be a great cash cow option. He's owned by 13% of the game, so I think a lot of people are seeing that potential as well. So I think he's going to be a really, really safe bet to have. I've got him in my front row reserve spot as well, because I think he'll be a good safe cash cow option, and he's only 219k. He's cheaper than Ryan James, and he's probably got more certainty of playing. So I think, he's going to be a safe bet to have, good cash cow option. Finally, moving on to Stefano Oitkamanu. So he's going to be playing for the West Tigers this season. I think there was a lot of hype and talk around him last season when Brad Fittler mentioned some comments about him potentially being an Origin bolter, or at least like an Origin player of the future. So I think a lot of us in the Supercoach community were like, what? 173k player who's potentially playing? Cheap, that means cash cow. Let's get him. But I think he only played like 8 minutes last season, 8 minutes per game. I think he wasn't really playing at all. But this season, I think he's predicted to be in the starting 17 for the Tigers. And, at 187k, if he averages like 20, 25 points, he's going to make us some money. As you can see, he's really, really popular. He's owned by about 42%. So I think he's going to be probably like a must-have cash cow option, given that he's so cheap. And, even if he just averages 5-10 points above his average from last season, he'll make us some money. So I think he's going to be a really, really safe cash cow option. And, an exciting player to watch as well. It's always good to have players in Supercoach who are just fun to watch in real life. It just makes the whole Supercoach experience better, in my opinion. Alright guys, well that's it. We've run through what I think are the best front row options to have in your Supercoach squads. So hopefully I've been able to present some useful stats and arguments for you guys to, to take when you guys choose your teams. But that will be it for this video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. If you did find some value out of it, I would really, really appreciate a like on the video. And do please subscribe as well, because I'll be putting out more videos for every other position as we get closer to the start of the Supercoach season. But that's it for now. Thanks.